Good morning. It's News from the Roots on Mountain Stream TV. I'm Avram Friedman. Today is Wednesday, July 25th, 2018. We're fortunate this morning to have with us Emily Zucchino, who is the Community Network Manager of the Dogwood Alliance. Thanks for being with us,
Thanks for having
Emily.
me.
I'm reading a lot about the Dogwood Alliance and the work you're doing these days. And I know we've talked about this. The Dogwood Alliance has been around for a long time, and you've been working to protect our forests, which is an immensely important thing to do. And but you've changed direction slightly in that now you're largely talking about forests in relation to climate issues, which is fascinating to me, and I'm really glad that you're doing this. Because it makes a strong connection, for one thing, to the Canary Coalition, my organization. But we found out when we first started the Canary Coalition back in 2000 that our focus was on air quality issues and air pollution. And the purpose of starting the Canary Coalition was we felt that it was important to focus on that issue because we felt it would impact and bring into the environmental community a very broad spectrum of people. Just by focusing on that one issue and not dealing with peripheral issues, because every time you bring in a new environmental issue, it alienates a different segment of the population. People who are working in forests, for instance, might be opposed to somebody who is against clear cutting. And so we thought by focusing on that narrow issue that it would broaden the spectrum of people who would join the work that we're doing. And we were correct at that time. We got the Chamber of Commerce on board. We got the local conservative newspaper on board, and many. But what we discovered very rapidly, really, was that you can't isolate one environmental issue from the other. Air quality impacts the forests. Air quality, when you're generating electricity by burning coal, it's impacting the water quality. All environmental issues are connected. So it's fascinating to me that Dogwood Alliance has come into the climate discussion. Tell us a little bit about the reasons that Dogwood Alliance came to that.
Sure. So Dogwood Alliance has always valued forests as an effective climate stabilizer, but I think, as you mentioned, there are certain issues that everybody can connect to, and all of us, from the time we're little and we're in elementary school, what is the first thing we learn about trees? We learn that trees sequester carbon and they help us breathe. And we know that our forests are the most effective climate stabilizer tool that we have available to us very easily. And we're now approaching, I think, a crisis in the climate movement and in the justice movement. And at Dogwood Alliance, we have always seen our forests as a solution. And I think what we're doing now is becoming more effective at talking about exactly how our forests can be a solution, and offering ways that our policymakers, that our grassroots activists can really join us in promoting forests as a solution to the climate crisis.
Tell us, if you will, some of the ways in which our forests are being threatened right now.
Sure. So a lot of people don't know this, but the U.S. is actually the #1 consumer of wood products, and we're also the #1 producer of wood products. And the southern U.S. is kind of at the top in the U.S. in terms of producing not only things like paper and pulpwood, but more recently there's a new threat on the map, and that's biomass or wood pellets. And So our forests are being heavily logged all across the U.S. In the past 50 years, we've actually lost 33 million acres of natural forests. And so if you look at maps from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, showing coverage of natural forests, you see a substantial decrease in forest cover in our natural forests. And what's happening instead is pine plantations are increasing. So the majority of our forests right now are quite young, under 20 or 30 years, and what we're really losing are those old growth natural forests that are so effective in helping to stabilize our climate, helping to provide homes for plants and wildlife, helping our communities have clean air and clean water and protection from floods and other natural disasters. And that's due to, in a lot of cases, industrial logging. And so I think that's a threat that people don't often see or know that it's out there, and that it's one of the biggest threats to our forests here in the U.S.
There's very little old-growth forest left, at least in the eastern United States. I know we've all visited the Joyce Kilmer National Forest. To me, every time I've gone there, it's almost a sadness, because that is such an exception to everything that's around us now, and I go there and I imagine the entire eastern seaboard covered with those enormous, beautiful trees. But you have to go practically to a museum. It's like Joni Mitchell's song, to see the trees that used to be here. Are there any parts of the East Coast where there are substantial stands of old growth still remaining?
Not substantial, and I think, as you mentioned, it is, I feel the same way when I visit Joyce Kilmer, because it should be the norm rather than the exception. Our trees, if left alone, can grow hundreds, if not more than 1,000 years, and in eastern North Carolina, in the Black River, there are actually cypress trees that are 1,600 years old, which is just incredible when you think about how rapidly we're logging our forests and what they're capable of if left standing.
And so now there's multiple uses. I mean, Duke Energy now is talking about. I mean, there was this bill called Senate Bill 3 back in 2007, in which the North Carolina passed what was called the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and practically the entire environmental community thought this was a great thing. And I have to tell you, the Canary Coalition was an exception to that. We did not support the Renewable Portfolio Standard because we didn't feel it was real. And one of the reasons we didn't feel it was real was because it included the burning of wood waste. And wood, first of all, how do you define wood waste, and is it really a renewable resource? And the feeling was, well, if they begin to build power plants or they integrate wood into the fuel stream for coal burning power plants, what happens when there's an economic downturn and wood waste is no longer available? Are they going to start cutting down trees? And nobody really anticipated that in the environmental community, other than the Canary Coalition and a few other organizations did. Blue Ridge Environmental Defense League did, and NC Warren did as well. Are they going to start cutting down trees? And the lawmakers just shook their, that'll never happen. That's not what this is about. But that's exactly what did happen. There was an economic downturn, and they had built these plants to burn wood, and rather than see them go idle, they started cutting down trees. And this was a big court case, and they went to court, and Duke Energy won the right to cut those trees down. because of the, that's how it was interpreted in that law. But this opens up a huge can of worms, because this has become a big industry, especially not so much in the United States, but in Western Europe. And I know the Dogwood Alliance has been involved with that. Tell us what's the status of that problem.
Sure, and just to give a little background to the issue, and it's interesting that you bring up, what happened here in North Carolina, because I think there's a lot of parallels to the situation in Europe right now, where years ago when they passed their 2020 climate policy, which on the surface of things is a great policy. They want a increase in renewable energy by 20%, a decrease in carbon emissions by 20% by the year 2020. And there's been different iterations of this law since it was originally passed. But when that was passed, it was great. Unfortunately, and it included loopholes like what you've just mentioned in terms of burning wood for energy. Yeah. And so in this policy, European countries started looking for ways they can hit those targets. And one of the things they turned to is biomass, or burning wood pellets for energy. And so you see coal power plants in Europe, specifically in the United Kingdom and the UK, that start transitioning their boilers to be able to not only burn coal, but burn wood pellets as well. And when this happened in Europe, the industry started looking for, well, where can we source these wood pellets? A lot of people, when I tell them about this campaign, mention, but Europe, they protect their forests. They have such great protections for forests in a lot of places in Europe. And in the U.S., especially in the southern U.S., where we have nearly 90% of the forested land in the southern U.S. owned by private owners, which means there's not regulations for what happens with our forests. So the industry starts looking to the southern U.S. as a source
mostly on private land.
Mostly on private land.
Okay.
Look, and so starting to log forests in the southern U.S. from private lands to be turned into these wood pellets, which are then taken to ports along the East Coast and shipped overseas to Europe and burned in these former coal incinerators.
What type of trees are being cut for wood pellets?
So just as you mentioned in North Carolina, where there was conversation around using waste wood, but that wasn't really defined, a very similar thing happened with this industry, where the industry came in saying, oh, we're going to use waste wood tops and limbs, and so to the average person that sounds like brush or leftover
scraps from
limbs
lumber,
and
from
scraps.
Construction and things like that, right?
What that can mean in the industry is wood that's potentially not going to a higher market, so not your high quality saw timber. And so in the case of the wood pellet industry, this can be anything from mixed stands of pine and hardwood wood, sometimes pine plantations, and in the most egregious cases, we see specifically from In Vivo, which is the world's leading producer of wood pellets, sourcing from bottomland hardwoods, where we have these old cypress trees
that had more BTUs than soft pine.
That, and this wood is also, it's often crooked or it might be rotten, which
it's not good for lumber.
Not good for lumber.
Right.
We know in the environmental community this is fantastic for habitat for wildlife, for our wetland forests in terms of mitigating floods and other natural disasters. Those forests are very, very important.
And it's part of the natural biodiversity of the
exactly.
region. Yeah.
To the industry, it's waste wood.
Product, right.
And so we see 3% by In Vivo's own admissions of their product coming from these really special bottomland hardwood forests. And so that's what's being logged. If you visit Dogwood Alliance's website, you can see investigations that Dogwood Alliance has done of this industry, and it's just horrific to see what's left behind after this industry comes through. And this is all in the name of renewable energy, going in and clear cutting acres and acres of our precious coastal forests to be turned into these wood pellets that are then burned for energy at the point of combustion, so at the smokestack where these things are being burned. They're actually putting more carbon into the atmosphere than coal.
Yeah, and it's such a false equivalency to say, and this is, I know the rationale that's being used by is that, well, it's actually carbon neutral because when you can replant trees that are renewable resources. Yeah, but it takes 30 or 60 years for trees to grow to maturity, but when you burn it, it's instantly releasing carbon into the atmosphere, so it's adding carbon to the atmosphere. That is it not addressing climate change at all, except in a negative manner.
Exactly, and in a lot of cases it's making it worse. Not only are we putting that carbon into the atmosphere right now at a time when we need to be drastically scaling down the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, but we're destroying one of our most, as I mentioned earlier, our most effective climate stabilizing solutions. Our trees sequester carbon. Even if we phase out fossil fuel tomorrow, which we need to do, we've got to phase out these dirty polluting industries. At the same time, we need to be increasing our carbon sequestration. And that is where our forests play a crucial role in the climate movement, and we cannot be cutting them down and burning them, putting more carbon into the atmosphere, and all under the guise of clean energy.
And hardwoods in general, I think, sequester more carbon than do evergreen trees. Is that true?
As I understand it, they do, and because they grow slower and they can grow older, they hold more carbon.
Yeah.
And so this is often, a myth put out by the industry that younger trees can sequester more carbon, and what's really happening is the rate compared to, the size of the tree is a little higher, but we see with older trees, the more and longer that trees grow and continue to live, they continue to absorb carbon and they hold on to that carbon, which as soon as that tree is logged and burned, that carbon is immediately released back into the atmosphere.
And hardwoods in general are getting hit pretty hard. I mean, in terms of rarefication, because in general, when land is replanted in trees, it's planted to make, in the southeast, I know, lumber and toilet paper, loblolly pines, white pines, and in a monoculture. And often those areas that are replanted in this monoculture are then sprayed with herbicides to prevent deciduous growth and varied growth, so that these areas can be managed more easily for industry. So what we're doing is we're removing biodiversity, habitat, and replacing them with industrial monoculture that does not serve the same purpose in terms for anything other than for the product that the end product that they're intended for. I mean, this is a horror. I mean, our forests are disappearing rapidly around the world, not just in the United States, around equatorial areas in Brazil, and I know the Dogwood Alliance is involved worldwide. Basically, and you're part of a vast network of organizations around the world. Can you speak to that? I mean, what other organizations are doing the type of work that you're doing?
Sure, I can speak to that, and I'll want to go back to one of the points you made right before that as well. Dogwood Alliance, our mission is actually to protect specifically the unique forests and communities of the southern U.S.
Okay.
So we are very focused in the southern U.S. As I mentioned earlier, the southern U.S. is one of the world's top producers of wood products, and we've really seen globally, as you said, there's threats across the globe to forests, and there's not enough being done to protect those forests. We've also seen a huge lack of awareness and lack of work in the southern U.S., which is why we've chosen to focus specifically in the southern U.S. We do partner with organizations all around the world, specifically as we've been doing more work in Europe with the wood pellet industry. We have many partners who do a lot of work on the wood pellet campaign in Europe, whether it's lobbying with elected officials and advocating for better climate policies at the European level, or visiting the U.S. to get a sense of what's happening on the ground. This is a global problem. We are focusing in the South, but when we talk about climate, it doesn't matter where those forests are. They're going to be sequestering carbon, and they're going to benefit not only locally, where they're going to provide so much for the local communities, but globally in terms of the carbon sequestration benefits, and that's why this is such an important campaign. And I wanted to go back, you were talking a little bit about, what happens with a lot of these pine plantations that I mentioned earlier, that we've lost 33 million acres of natural forests in the U.S., and all of that has been converted to pine plantations. So you'll often hear the industry talking about forests have actually increased. And so this is the line that's used a lot to policymakers to be able to continue their business model of increased logging year after year. And they'll say, when you look at the numbers, we're seeing increased forest coverage. When you look at that and you dig into that a little bit deeper, that's where we start seeing, wait, we're losing all of these natural forests, and instead what we're growing are these, as you said, monoculture pine plantations. So anyone who's ever driven through eastern North Carolina, you might look out and see what looks like rows and rows of pine trees. Those are not naturally occurring forests. Those have been managed specifically for logging, as you mentioned, and so they use a lot of fertilizer, a lot of chemicals to be able to grow those trees quickly and increase logging rotations so that they can be logged more and more. And what I wanted to mention about this is that this is a direct result of the policies that have been put in place for logging. And I mentioned before that most of our forested land is privately owned. Well, when you look at surveys that have been done to landowners across the South, and you ask them, what's important to you? Why do you keep this land? Survey after survey shows that our landowners are not keeping their land because they want to log it. The most important thing to landowners is often things like the aesthetic value, being able to have those woods for future generations, being able to hunt and fish and use those forests as forests. Now, unfortunately, when industry comes in, when forestry comes in and works with those landowners to develop a management plan, because often those landowners do need to have some income that they're generating from those forests. And as you mentioned with the pine plantations, what happens is, even if you have a natural forest, the forestry industry comes in and they give you a management plan, and they say the best way to manage this forest will be to clear cut it, cut everything down, and then plant it again in these rows and rows of pine plantations. And not only are they encouraged to do that, but there's also policies and tax incentives that further encourage and incentivize landowners to operate under this management plan. And so it's really a shame, and it's resulted in a situation where many landowners are going to turn to this model because it's what's been promoted and it's where the incentives are. And what Dogwood Alliance and other organizations are advocating for is a different method of using our private lands. I've talked a little bit about the benefits that forests provide, and I could go on and on, but these are really a public good. When you're a community member and you're living near forested land, these forests, they're filtering water, they're providing clean air. as I've mentioned, they're protecting us from natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, strong winds. When these forests are cut down, all of those public benefits are lost. And so rather than incentivizing our landowners to be cutting down these forests, we need to be looking at new and innovative policies that are incentivizing our landowners to leave those forests standing as a public benefit. And that is not happening right now. And so it's really, this is why Dogwood Alliance is focusing in on the southern United States, where we have got to see a shift in the way that we value our forests. We have got to stop valuing our forests only when they're cut down for economic profit and start looking at what are all the benefits that our standing forests provide. And they're numerous, and there are many studies that show that actually leaving forests standing will provide even more economic benefits for local governments, for communities. We spend millions on natural disaster recovery. We look at what happened with Hurricane Matthew in North Carolina a few years ago. And just by implementing this, keeping our forests standing, we can really mitigate a lot of those negative impacts.
So, what you're saying is we have to change policy. We have to have government agencies that don't advise people to clear cut. So what has been your reception from state legislators and other government officials, the governor, and other industries as well in North Carolina or in the Southeast? How have they received the information that you're giving to them?
A lot of people, when they hear this, it makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned, landowners often, they don't want to cut their forests. They want to keep them standing. And we're beginning to work in coalitions. We're beginning to work with policymakers and develop proposals and offer solutions. As many people know, in North Carolina, Governor Cooper decided to be part of the Climate Alliance and commit to the agreements that were made in the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I think we have a huge opportunity right now in the state of North Carolina to begin advancing some creative solutions with forests. And Dogwood Alliance has been not only advocating for the halt and stop of the destructive wood pellet industry. We cannot be cutting down our North Carolina forests and shipping them to Europe to be burned for energy, but we need to actually be increasing protections as well. And so we've begun to work with the Cooper administration, and we need help. We need people across North Carolina to be also advocating for protection of our forests. And I hope, and I'm optimistic, that the Cooper administration will develop a positive climate action plan that does not include false solutions like biomass, and does include things like protections for our forest and the inclusion of communities who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so I think, overall we're in the beginning phases, but we're beginning to see positive reception.
But in the meantime, companies like Enviva have come into the Southeast, and North Carolina particularly, and are building these plants to manufacture wood pellets and ship them overseas. And I think they want to open up more plants. What does Governor Cooper say about that?
Governor Cooper has been silent on the issue of biomass, and we would like him to take a stand, and we have communicated that to him. All of these facilities came in under the previous administration. And so right now we have we have 3 existing wood pellet facilities in North Carolina and 1 under construction.
From Enviva.
From Enviva. And these are all in eastern North Carolina. Every single one of them is in an environmental justice community, meaning that a greater percentage of the population is living under the poverty line and are communities of color. And these are where these facilities are going in. And all of them together, all of those facilities together, when the fourth one in Richmond County comes online, will be produced clear cutting 50,000 of, I'm sorry, I need to double check that number, but I think it's 50 acres a day from these facilities, all four of them together in North Carolina. And so just massive amounts of forest being destroyed to be sent to Europe. And as I mentioned, this was all under the previous administration, and the Cooper administration has been silent on the issue of the wood pellet industry in North Carolina.
I'm pretty much ignorant about Inviva and what its operation does. Okay, I know it manufactures wood pellets. What does Inviva, what are these plants that are manufacturing wood pellets, what do they use for fuel? Are they burning wood pellets? So they're burning their own fuel to make more wood pellets.
They do some burning on site. What they do, each of these facilities has about 200 trucks a day coming in and out, loaded up with whole trees.
Semi-sized trucks. Okay.
That's right, coming in often with whole trees, sometimes with already, trees that have been chipped on site that are coming into these facilities. And with the whole trees, they suck all the water out of them and then compress them into these little wood pellets.
So it's an energy-intensive
It's very energy-intensive.
And they're burning wood pellets to create that energy. And something I found out about companies that burn wood products in general. We think of wood, it's natural, resource, it's renewable. Well, here in Silva, we have a company called Jackson Paper Company. And as paper companies go, it's true, it's better than most because they produce only one product. It's the brown corrugated filament in between the two layers of cardboard. And they create these big rolls of this brown paper made from recycled paper. So that if you go past there, you'll see these mounds of bales of recycled paper that they then process into a slurry, remove all the impurities, and make it into recycled paper. But one thing I found out about that process is that burning wood is not at all a clean technology. In fact, it rivals coal it's basically the same as burning coal. Coal is just made up of fossilized wood and other living matter, and more concentrated. But when you burn wood, you release all the chemicals, all the toxins that you're burning when you burn coal. And one in particular, which is very alarming, is hydrogen chloride, which although the other name for hydrogen chloride is hydrochloric acid, and it's classified as a carcinogen. It's by the EPA, and if you know anything about that process, for them to classify something as a carcinogen, it's got to be really bad because they have all kinds of industry pressures against them classifying things as carcinogens, and there's a certain threshold. If an individual industry burns less than 10 tons a year, or emits less than 10 tons a year of not only hydrogen chloride, but a whole list of toxins, hazardous chemicals. But any one individual chemical like hydrogen chloride, anything less than 10 tons a year or 25 tons a year of a combination of toxic chemicals, if they're below that threshold, they do not have to install emission controls or maximum emission control technology for those chemicals. And so Jackson Paper falls under that threshold, which means that these chemicals are being released into the air in a somewhat arbitrary manner. And so I imagine, you mentioned the environmental justice issue of this, the communities where these plants are located are releasing a whole host of extremely toxic and hazardous chemicals into the air. And again, if they fall below that threshold, they're not required to install emission controls.
This is one of the biggest concerns that we hear from the communities where these Enviva wood pellet facilities are being built.
Yeah.
I've talked a little bit about the process of how they make the wood pellets, but inherent in that process is a great deal of emissions and a great deal of wood dust. So people living near these facilities, and I've experienced this touring one of the facilities, there's tiny little flecks of wood dust. And so when I toured Enviva's facility in Northampton, I had little bits of wood dust in my eyes, in my ears, in my nose, and in the folds of my clothing. And this was just 2 hours. So you can imagine living near these facilities, and you're breathing that in day after day. In Sampson County, North Carolina, where Enviva has one of their newest wood pellet facilities, we worked with the local community to do some air quality monitoring before and after Enviva began operation. And what we found at that facility was a 75% increase in fine particulate matter. And so this is the stuff that's really bad. You can't see it.
That's just the particulate matter.
That's just the particulate matter. And that's what communities are breathing in day after day. More recently, Environmental Integrity Project, which is a law center based out of Georgia that has been working on the wood pellet issue, started looking into a lot of the permits for these facilities all across the South. And what they found is that this industry, and North Carolina is the worst offender, is actually emitting far more than they have been permitted to do so. And this is similar to what you were talking about. There's these loopholes, and there's certain thresholds that companies can stay under. And in North Carolina, they've managed to skirt around this, which is actually a violation of the Clean Air Act, and are emitting far more than they should be, all under the excuse that it is too expensive to install those VOC controls. And so this is an area that we would like to continue working with the Cooper administration and North Carolina DAQ to implement stronger protections on these facilities.
So you're telling me that they are actually violating laws and regulations that are existing. How is that happening? Is it just somebody's choosing not to enforce those laws and regulations? And that comes under the auspices of the governor and the attorney general, I would think.
You know, again, these are facilities that came in.
The DAQ, or the DEQ. They're just not enforcing it.
And it goes back to these loopholes where Enviva has very cleverly.
So they're claiming that they are meeting regulations of the law, but in actuality they're avoiding the spirit of the law.
They're coming in as, and it gets very technical, and all of this can be found on the Dogwood Alliance website for anybody who's interested in digging in and learning all the specifics of this. But essentially they're coming in as minor synthetics, and as they either increase production or sometimes change from hardwoods to pine, which they have different levels of toxins and other things that they emit, and then Enviva will kind of reapply for a permit and be locked in under some of the previous thresholds that they applied under, and all of this has resulted in every single Enviva facility in North Carolina being, according to the Environmental Integrity Project, in violation of the Clean Air Act. And so this is an area where the North Carolina Division of Air Quality has said, this is something that we're willing to look into. We want to meet with communities. We want to get a better sense of what's going on here, but as of yet, nothing has changed.
And as you say, I mean, these are located in area. I mean, we run into this so often. They locate these these facilities, and not just in Viva and wood pellet industries, but pipelines and other waste dumps, and in poor Black or Hispanic or Native American communities, where the feeling is by industry that they'll meet the least political resistance, because the people that live there just are struggling on such a basic day-to-day level that they cannot organize themselves, and they don't have the resources to fight against this politically. I mean, we're running against this. The same thing with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Originally, the pipelines were routed through Chapel Hill and Durham. When they, as soon as they threw the first stone in the water there was massive resistance. So, okay, let's move this over to here, you know. And in the meantime, they're building so rapidly that it's almost impossible to organize. I mean, the people are opposed to it, I believe, you know, where they're living, but they simply don't have the time and resources. These industries are so powerful, and they have, you know, within Viva, that they have the cover, political figures have the cover of, well, this is to address climate change. You know, that's the reason the European countries have turned to biomass massively in some places, and are claiming it's part of their program to address climate change. But it's a cover, and it's this whole thing is so Orwellian. You know, from top to bottom, that it's just very difficult when you have to combat just to define truth. And to define facts, it's so difficult to convince. First, you have to unconvince them of the fact that it's not really helping the climate, and then you have to explain to them what's so horrible about what's happening. And I really commend the Dogwood Alliance for taking on that, you know, beast.
Sure, and you know, and I think you're right. It's by design, and Dogwood Alliance partners closely with community members who are living near these facilities, and all of our work on the ground is led by these communities who do not want an in vivo wood pellet facility in their community, and we hear from these folks on the ground that they know that their county and their elected officials have been identified as an easy target, because these are areas where there's often high unemployment, as I mentioned earlier, you know, higher proportions of people living under the poverty line. And so I think as a county commissioner, you don't have a lot of options, and you want jobs for your community. And we hear all the time that people in these rural, poor communities are being forced to choose between jobs and their lives, really, when you're facing facilities like these that threaten your health and your longevity. And, you know, these facilities are coming into areas that are already, you mentioned some of the industries that we're facing here in North Carolina. These areas are already heavily dominated by other industries. And I talked a little bit about, you know, air quality and permitting. What happens when a facility like Enviva comes in? And we saw this in Richmond County, which is down near the South Carolina border. And this is the most recent plant that has come in by Enviva. It's currently under construction. They come in and they don't look at all of the other industries that are already polluting. When they apply for their air quality permit, it is just looking at Enviva. And so not only is Enviva bad on its own, but it is now compounded by all of the other industries. So in Richmond County, we have things like a CSX rail line, a Duke power plant, chicken facilities. It's one of the proposed areas for
another thing from the renewable portfolio standards.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we have, an area like Richmond County that already has the highest level of asthma in the region, and now they're getting hit with this plant. And it's a huge justice issue combined with the fact that our standing forest can provide so many public goods, and we'd love to work with the Cooper administration to look at alternatives. Instead of cutting down our forest, let's look at a 21st century new forest economy that does things like provide jobs through restoration, that does things like encourage people to make a living off of sustainably using their forests for growing different food products or medicinal products. We know that study after study show there's more economic benefits in things like restoration. Governor Cooper recently has been talking about the many benefits from our outdoor recreation economy. And that's been, I think, heavily dominated here in Western North Carolina, where we're so lucky to have such an abundance of publicly available forested lands. And that's not been the case as much in Eastern North Carolina. We look at an industry like that. I talked about some of the cypress trees, 1,600 years old, in Eastern North Carolina along the Black River. That could be a great tourist economy. People want to come in and kayak and use trail systems in Eastern North Carolina. So there's all of these alternatives that would not only be a better economic provider for these rural communities, but would have the additional benefit of preventing some of the high costs we see with things like natural disaster cleanup.
Yeah. I mean, economics is the key. I think ultimately that we have to learn to use as an environmental, to recognize in the environmental community that, and it's the same here in Canton, we have this paper mill, which for many decades has been polluting the air and the water in Western North Carolina. But when a company comes into an economically depressed area and suddenly brings in jobs that pay $20 an hour, people who are living desperate lives, are going to, they don't care what the air smells like, and that is the problem. I mean, these industries have tremendous economic power, and can show, make people's eyes shine green with the money for the moment, and not think about, the fact that suddenly there's a spike in lung cancer, and other types of cancer, and other diseases. I mean, heart disease and respiratory diseases and nervous system diseases and all the manifestations of air pollution and water pollution and the other impacts on the environment and the way of life in the community. All they see at first is the money that they haven't had until now. And but I think that's also a product. That's not the only way that people can achieve economic success, and there are ways of doing it that are much more friendly to the environment and to the public health in general, and the health of the community in general, the psychic health of the psychological community, aspect of the community. For instance, and I think what you're saying is absolutely true, that we have to not just say no to in viva, not just say no to paper plants, not say no to other environmentally detrimental industries. We have to provide viable alternatives that provide a living wage for people. That all of these issues are coming together, right, in the consciousness, I think, of the American people in general, and it's something that we just have to continue to hammer away at. And another issue, that I know the Canary Coalition has become very much involved in, and people often ask me, well, you're an environmental organization, what are you getting involved in that? Is money in politics. The Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court that allows industries and corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns to promote the policies that they want, and that to make more money on a short-term basis, at the expense of future generations. That's the Citizens United decision was an anti-environmental decision, as well as anti-human rights decision, anti-women, anti-everything. Any progressive cause you can think of. And so we've become very much involved in the We the People campaign in North Carolina, and it's a tough sell. It's a tough sell, but it's something that we have to do, I think.
And I think we're living in this paradigm that has really created the crisis that we are in right now. We are in a climate crisis, and we are in a justice crisis. And I see this crisis as an opportunity. And I think a lot of people do in the environmental movement, in the climate movement, in the justice movement. We have at our hands right now a crisis that should be handled as an opportunity. And what I mean by that is that as we make the transition to clean energy, which we will have to do, we have got to make sure that there's a corresponding power shift. And that's where we need to all be calling on our elected officials, on our decision makers and our leaders to be promoting a just transition. So we cannot just have a transition. We need to look at who are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, who have already suffered the most from the existing paradigm that we're in. And then we need to look at how can we uplift those communities in this transition. So if we're looking at some of our eastern areas that have been dominated by the polluting industries that have gotten us to the crisis that we're in today, coal plants, natural gas plants, pipelines, industrial logging, we need to look at those areas and say, how do we make that a crucial part of this transition, because they need to be. And it's some of the things I talked about earlier. We need to be looking at new economic solutions that value our natural world for the benefits that they provide just by existing. And we need to look at some of our new energy systems and make sure that the jobs that are created from creating and installing solar panels are concentrated in the communities that are lower income, because nobody should have to choose between their health and their economic well-being. And I really believe and I really hope that we can come together as a movement and work with our policymakers to make sure that this transition that is coming, because it will come, it has to come, make sure that this is an opportunity and that this is a just transition.
I think it's the only way forward. We have to begin to understand the interaction, the interrelationship between all aspects of not only of the environment. When you build solar panels and you build windmills, you're saving forests. At the same time, you're providing jobs for people in low-income areas, because the solar energy industry and the energy efficiency industry, which may be even more important than the solar energy industry, is universal. When you invest in efficiency and solar energy and create new industries around, when you create new government policies that promote that, you're creating jobs everywhere. It's not a central. It's inherently a decentralized industry, because you have to go to every rooftop. You have to examine every house, every building, every private, residential, commercial, and industrial building, and public buildings, schools and hospitals. All of these buildings. So we're talking about building a new industrial revolution, but one that is more conscious of the entire picture.
In the Green Revolution.
In the Green Revolution, in the public health revolution, I mean, in every aspect of our lives. And I think that's what we all have to come together and work toward together. And yeah, we can each have different focuses. The Dogwood Alliance can focus on forests,
Absolutely.
you know. The Canary Coalition can focus on smokestacks and on renewable energy resources, real renewable energy resources, and making those definitions. And at the same time, we have to get the money out of politics so that the real message is getting through. And all the Orwellian bullshit, if you will, excuse the expression, you know, gets exposed, and politicians get exposed for where the money is coming from, that impacts their decisions. You know, I have a lot of trouble with Governor Cooper. In the past, he's been very friendly to the environment. He was very active in executing the Clean Smokestacks Act, implementing the Clean Smokestacks Act. And he was very favorable toward doing that. But at the same time, he's now issued a permit for the Atlantic Coast pipeline. And he's being quiet on in vivo. Well, you can't be quiet, Governor Cooper. I'm sorry. That is inexcusable at this point in time. We don't have the time to waste on this nonsense. We have to look at real information. And not just rhetoric and propaganda from the industries that are only in it for one purpose, to make money. That time is past.
I agree, and the Dogwood Alliance has been very disappointed in the silence of Governor Cooper on the biomass industry in North Carolina. As I've mentioned, there's so many issues with this industry that have come to his attention. Last year, we had an opportunity to stop an Enviva plant in Richmond County. We delivered 10,000 petition signatures to Governor Cooper, had a letter delivered to Governor Cooper signed by the Canary Coalition, as well as 50 other organizations, more than 50 across North Carolina. And time and again, he has been silent. And so I want to talk just briefly about a new platform that Dogwood Alliance has been working on this year, and this is the Stand for Forest platform. And over the past few months, Dogwood Alliance has been working with climate, environmental leaders, justice leaders, scientists across the nation to develop a platform that calls for increased protection of our forests and decreased destruction of our forests. And currently, we've just finalized that platform, and now we are working with organizations across the U.S. to sign on to this platform. And so I encourage anybody who represents a business, an environmental organization, a justice organization to visit dogwoodalliance.org and sign the Stand for Forest platform. And this is a national push to include forests in the climate and justice movement. And this will also support local campaigns such as the one here in North Carolina. And I hope that Governor Cooper will see that this is an issue that is important to people across North Carolina, to people across the U.S., and that this is an opportunity for him to be a leader. He has agreed to be part of the Climate Alliance. He has stood up as a climate leader, but his actions are not matching his words, and he needs to do more. And I hope that Governor Cooper will decide to take a stand. We'll stand for forests. We'll stand for environmental justice. We'll stand for a strong and just climate action plan. And I encourage everybody in North Carolina to join Dogwood Alliance and communicating to Governor Cooper that this is important, and to join other climate and justice organizations in the state who are doing this work as well.
Yeah, and I think the message has to be, people are watching, and that people are there are politicians now that are standing up.
Mhm.
There are many who are still afraid to, because to stand up against Inviva is not only to stand up against one corporation, but it's to stand up in the face of the political power that these industries have. And, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with the American Legislative Exchange Council and the Koch brothers, and they're all working together. They know how to work together and use their political power to implement policies that they want to continue for their own economic benefit. And we saw their power in the 2016 election, where Hillary Clinton physically could not speak up about Standing Rock in the face of abominable violations of human rights. You know, she simply could not stand up to the fossil fuel industry because of the money she was getting from that industry, and she had received throughout her whole life. You know, and that's just one example. You know, and here in North Carolina, Duke Energy has such enormous influence because of the money that they pour into political campaigns and lobbying. I mean, they control virtually everything in this state. And that people and politicians have to learn to stand up to that. And we have to let them know that we are watching and that they should not take our votes for granted. Regardless of who their opponents are, you know, I mean, we have to make them understand there is a bigger picture that they're not addressing right now, and it's going to impact everyone. Climate change, the destruction of our forests, the depletion of our natural resources. We are not thinking about future generations the way we need to be to survive as the human race on this planet. You know, that I think is what Governor Cooper has to understand, and the Republicans and the Democrats have to understand. It's no longer a question of rooting for your team. You know, it's a question of whether or not you understand that we're fighting for our survival right now. And again, the Dogwood Alliance is a wonderful organization that is doing exactly that. Before we leave, tell us again how you can become part of this this fight, and how you can sign up with the Dogwood Alliance and sign on to the campaign that you are initiating.
Yeah, absolutely. We are, Dogwood Alliance is inherently a grassroots organization, and we cannot do the work that we do without the support of people all across North Carolina, all across the South, and so we have a number of ways for people to get involved. You can visit our website, dogwoodalliance.org, follow us on Facebook at Dogwood Alliance, and here in North Carolina specifically, we have a petition to Governor Cooper calling on him to halt the expansion of the destructive wood pellet industry and increase protection for forests through the Climate Action Plan. And take a minute, sign that petition. If you represent an organization, take the pledge to stand for forests, and we always love to have volunteers coming in to help us with a number of the aspects of our work.
So dogwoodalliance.org?
.org.
Okay. And is there is there a phone number or an email address that people can write to?
Sure, people can, all of this is on the website as well, so if all you remember is dogwoodalliance.org, that's great. You can reach me, Emily, at dogwoodalliance.org, and our office number is 828-251-2525. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
Okay, that's wonderful. Emily, thank you so much for coming and for this great conversation. One announcement before we go off the air here. We're not going off the air, but before we end this segment of today's programming, at 10 o'clock, in a few minutes, we're a few minutes behind schedule, we'll be showing our today's feature, which is part 7 of the Rain, River, Fish, and Faucet Forum that took place in Franklin on June 16th, and this segment is called Keep Your Banks from Running Off. And then we'll be following that with part 6, which we showed yesterday as our feature, which was Dirt on the Dam. Thanks everybody again for watching News from the Roots on Mountain Stream TV. If you value this programming and would like to see it to continue, please consider making a donation to the Canary Coalition. Mountain Stream TV is a project of the Canary Coalition. You can go to mountainstream.tv and there's a donate button at the top of that page. You can also go to canarycoalition.org and hit the donate button there, or you can send, if you prefer, a check or money order to the Canary Coalition at P.O. Box 653 in Sylva, S-Y-L-V-A, North Carolina 28779. Have a great day, and I hope to see you tomorrow.